Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go my review of WCW's Uncensored 1999. Starting off the evening, we'll go to our first match of the night. It is for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. It is Mikey Whipwreck versus Billy Kidman. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Whipwreck and Kidman, with Whipwreck keeping the pace of the match. But Kidman ultimately hits his signature shooting star press on Mikey Whipwreck, pins him for the 3. And your winner of the match, and at that time still WCW Cruiserweight Champion, is Billy Kidman. Hats off to Billy Kidman for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a Harlem Street Fight. It is Vincent versus Stevie Ray. I thought this was an okay matchup. Stevie Ray was keeping the pace throughout the entire match, with Stevie Ray ultimately hitting his signature slapjack on Vincent, pins him for the 3. And your winner of the match is Stevie Ray. Hats off to Stevie Ray for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Kevin Nash versus Rey Mysterio. I thought this was a good match. Nash was keeping the pace throughout the entire match, pretty much, with Mysterio hitting a springboard leg drop on Nash. But Nash ultimately hits a devastating jackknife powerbomb on Mysterio, pins for the 3. And your winner of the match is Kevin Nash. Hats off to Kevin Nash for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Ernest Miller and Sonny Ono versus Jerry Flynn. I thought this was an awful match. Jerry attacks Ernest Miller. Flynn was keeping the pace of the match. Flynn then throws Miller into Sonny Ono, but Ono tags in. Flynn then covers Ono, pins for the 3. And your winner of the match is Jerry Flynn. Hats off to Jerry Flynn for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a Falls Count Anywhere matchup. It is Raven versus Hack versus Bam Bam Bigelow. I thought this was a good match. Raven and Bigelow both attack Hack. Hack then hits Bigelow with a trash can. Bigelow then hits Hack with a chair shot. Bigelow then hits Greetings from Ashbury Park on Raven. Chastity gets involved in the match by hitting a low blow on Raven. Hack then covers, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Hack. Hats off to Hack for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Curt Hennig and Barry Windham versus Dean Malenko and Chris Benoit in a strap match, lumberjack match for the WCW Tag Team Championships. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams. Arn Anderson is here. Lumberjacks then attack Windham and Hennig. Dean and Benoit are keeping the pace of the match. Dean then applies a Texas Cloverleaf on Hennig. Arn then hits Hennig with a tire iron. Benoit then hits a diving headbutt off the top rope on Hennig. Pins for the 3. And your winners of the match, and at that time new WCW Tag Team Champions, are Dean Malenko and Chris Benoit. Hats off to Dean Malenko and Chris Benoit for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a dog collar matchup. It is Chris Jericho versus Perry Saturn. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Jericho and Saturn, with Saturn attacking Jericho. Saturn was keeping the pace of the match, but Saturn ultimately hits a Death Valley driver on Jericho, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Perry Saturn. Hats off to Saturn for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Booker T versus Scott Steiner for the WCW Television Championship. It was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Booker T and Steiner, with Booker T keeping the pace of the match. Bagwell then goes to hit Booker T with a chair shot, but missed and hit Scott Steiner. Booker T capitalizes on this, goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time new WCW Television Champion, is Booker T. Hats off to Booker T for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of WCW's Uncensored 1999. It is Ric Flair versus Hollywood Hogan in a steel cage match. First blood steel cage match for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Flair and Hogan, with Flair keeping the pace of the match. David Flair is here. Arn Anderson makes his way out to the ring as well. Arn Anderson attacks David Flair. Flair then hits Hogan with a tire iron. Then he applies a figure 4 leg lock on Hogan. Hogan ends up tapping out. And your winner of the match, and at that time, new WCW World Heavyweight Champion, is the Nature Boy, Ric Flair. Hats off to Flair for getting the win in this matchup. A couple of things I want to say about WCW Uncensored before I get out of here, man. Number one, this was a solid event. I was always a big fan of the Uncensored pay-per-views because it kind of brought in a hardcore dynamic to WCW. 9 times out of 10, some of the matches on the card for Uncensored were kind of a hardcore match, chair match, lumberjack match, steel cage match. It always brought that, hardcore element into WCW, which I was always a big fan of, especially with ECW. A couple things about Uncensored 1999 before I thought it was, for what it's worth, I thought it was a really good card. A couple of things that I did notice is that, number one, the opening matchup. Mikey Whipwreck made his WCW debut. Now, a lot of people might not know who Mikey Whipwreck is. Mikey Whipwreck made a big name for himself over in ECW. Obviously, later on, went over to WCW, had matches in WCW. It was a great debut for Mikey, to be honest with you. I think Mikey Whipwreck, did a hell of a job against Billy Kidman. But with that being said, and I mentioned this multiple times about other ECW talent that's come over from ECW into WCW. Some of those superstars that left, ECW and went over to WCW, some of them had great careers. Eddie Guerrero's number one, Benoit, Raven. Some of those guys had really good careers after they had left ECW, even Dean Malenko. But with that being said, there are some superstars that have left ECW and went over to WCW, and it really didn't pan out too well for them, in my honest opinion. A couple of names come to mind. Public Enemy, Rocco Rock and Johnny Grunge. I feel like their career was better suited in ECW. Hack, a.k.a. the Sandman. Sandman made a humongous name for himself over in ECW. Had a horrible career in WCW. But Mike Awesome is another one. Mike Awesome is an absolute ECW legend. Hardcore legend at that. I would put him up there as a hardcore legend, to be honest with you. I mean, some of the matches that Mike Awesome had in ECW were phenomenal matches. I mean, one of the biggest matches I remember from Mike Awesome was Mike Awesome versus Tanaka. Masato Tanaka from ECW. They had fantastic matches that honestly carried over from not just ECW, but FMW as well. A lot of people don't remember that Mike Awesome and Tanaka wrestled for FMW, and it was a company that was run by Onita over in Japan, and FMW were really known for the exploding barbed wire death matches over in Japan. So, obviously Mike Awesome had, a hardcore dynamic well before he came over to ECW. So, but long story short, some of these guys that came over from ECW to WCW, it just didn't really pan out for those guys. And I think some of those guys were better suited staying in ECW because I just feel like they really didn't have a fit for them on the roster for WCW. I think WCW's hardcore division was absolutely horrendous. And the matches, some of the matches they had for the hardcore division were just atrocious, man. I remember the Junkyard Brawl they had. It was just a horrible idea. It was not a good match at all. But, I had to put Mikey Whipwreck in that conversation as far as, maybe Whipwreck should have stayed in ECW and not went over to WCW. But all in all, good matchup. Hats off to Kidman for getting the win in that match and retaining the Cruiserweight Championship. Kevin Nash versus Mysterio, again, really solid matchup. Kind of a David versus Goliath kind of match, if you will. Ernest Miller and Sonny Omo versus Jerry Flynn. Again, I thought it was an awful match, man. I don't know a whole lot about Jerry Flynn. And it goes hand in hand with Ernest Miller, man. Obviously, the stigma around Jerry Flynn and Ernest Miller and guys like Glacier, they all come from an MMA background. And honestly, for what it's worth, I think Ernest Miller and Jerry Flynn and even Glacier, I would have chose a different line of work for those kind of guys. Maybe go back into MMA or karate or Muay Thai, whatever those guys were doing to build their craft and what they thought was going to work into WCW. I think they would have been better suited in maybe like MMA, UFC, some kind of karate, Muay Thai, something like that. I feel like that dynamic that you bring in to professional wrestling, it doesn't always work. And again, when you have that background with MMA and stuff like that, sometimes it does benefit the wrestler. Sometimes it doesn't, man. And sometimes their mindset is so much MMA that it just takes away from the wrestling aspect of the match. And I think Jerry Flynn and Ernest Miller are the pure definition of that. I think they were better suited in an MMA kind of field than professional wrestling, in my honest opinion. It just made for an awful match, in my honest opinion. Raven and Hawk versus Bigelow. Again, I kind of touched base on this earlier. You know, with as far as Hawk, I think he was better suited in ECW as the Sandman. Hennig and Barry Windham versus Malenko and Benoit. Great tag team matchup, and I was happy that Benoit and Malenko ended up getting the win and becoming the new WCW Tag Team Champions. Then obviously Ric Flair versus Hollywood Hogan in a First Blood Steel Cage match. Solid match from top to bottom. Two absolute legends, two Hall of Famers, and it always makes for a great main event, no matter what card they're wrestling on. So, made for a really good, solid card for WCW Uncensored 1999. But with that being said, just like I do with every single one of these pay-per-views, you guys know by now, I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of a 10. 1 being the absolute worst, 10 being the absolute best. I'm going to have to give WCW's Uncensored 1999 a solid 4.5 at best. But this is my review of WCW's Uncensored 1999. I hope you guys are out there staying safe, be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.